From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, my name is Larry Appelbaum from the Music Division here at the Library of Congress. It's always fun to talk to John Szwed. You know, we were talking earlier today when you arrived, and we started to get into some things, and one thing led to another, and I looked at my watch and 3 hours had flown by. And that's what it's like to talk to John Szwed. He brings, and it's not just because he's an anthropologist, it's not just because he's an author and a biographer and a scholar. It's that he has this abiding curiosity about all things, certainly related to music, but even beyond music. John, welcome back to the Library of Congress.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Yeah. It's not your first time here. Do you remember your first time here at the library?
Doing something for the library or just wandering in?
Well, I mean, to do some work here.
It was Jelly Roll Morton. Yes, the Jelly Roll Morton box
For the
set.
box set.
When we did, the staff dug up the original mics, and it was kind of interesting to see what people actually used to talk to and they record with in 1930, what was the day, 38, 39, 40, somewhere in there, yeah.
38, yeah. You won a Grammy for that, for the booklet.
I did. I suppose I should have shared it with the library.
Well, it's an important piece of scholarship. It's an interesting story also. Why don't we talk just a little bit about that? Because it was one of the great pleasures for me as an engineer is I got to work with the original discs to transfer them. We literally got them into the right speed finally, which meant the songs are in the right key. But what did you actually do? What were you, what materials did you work with to inform your booklet?
Well, the real challenge, and I only do bother these things if they're challenges, is that I remember a teacher saying to me once, what would you say about a person who made claims that were absolutely unbelievable, like I invented this or that, or you know, I was the first to do this and that, and you know this is wrong? Do you just blow him off as a blowhard and a fool? And then you find out that he was 90% accurate, but everyone won't acknowledge that. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating. So the guy has been treated as a buffoon in some ways, and in his time as a nuisance, but he was telling the truth with things he claimed. So that was my first test to see just how much this person could do. And the joke was on me. You know, I may have gotten a Grammy for it, but months later I found out more and more and more and thought, oh boy, I missed this. I mean, could a guy claim that he invented jazz and could claim that he had been a hit in all sorts of media, that he sold thousands of records, et cetera, and also been a boxing promoter and also formed the first multiracial film company, it was in DC, by the way, and also been in auto racing with Jack Johnson, the boxer, and it goes on and on, and I had a wife who ran an award-winning restaurant, and I had missed all that.
How did you learn these facts?
From a British website, which obsessively seemed to track down everything you could find in the world. There are such sites where people seem to live in that site, and they live for that moment. It makes you wonder then, is it possible to do all those things? I suppose. I mean, no one's claimed otherwise. And to use the name of Jack Johnson turned out to have been a musician as well as a boxer, had a band, recorded, and used to take a gigantic, oversized bass around with him to play with things. So, you know, this is perfectly reasonable. Oh, I left out something. While he was doing the show at the Library of Congress, so it wasn't a show, it was a recording session, he had a radio show in Baltimore, making him the first radio DJ of that kind of music, and was presumably promoting his own music as well as others, but there you have it. Lomax didn't even know that.
Are there any surviving air checks?
Not that I can find. This would be 30, 38, something like 39.
Any description of what the content?
It was called The History of Jazz, but it could have been anything.
Huh. So did he invent jazz?
He's the first person to copyright a composition which was called jazz. He certainly broke with the previous tradition. I don't know. I mean, there's an Italian film about this. What's it called? The Legend of 19-something? It's a very, very popular cult film in Italy, 1916 maybe. And let's see, Clarence, I forget who plays. It's about a pianist. It's a long story, but it has to do with a person who claims to have superhuman abilities at a keyboard because he spent his whole life on a boat with a keyboard. It's challenged by Jelly Roll Morton, who claims he's the greatest pianist alive. And Morton clearly beats him, but by the magic of film, the other guy grows 2 extra arms and plays basically 4-handed piano and beats him. But the end of, a film that's really awful, I don't know who ever said this, but really awful films sometimes have one line that make it worth sitting through. And the one line in this film, I can't say for under our circumstances, but 2 longshoremen years later are walking by and they said, and what did Morton say after he got beat? He said, jazz. So,
fill in the blank.
It was worth sitting through the film, to watch them destroy the film in a way for that one line.
So let me get some context for you and your curiosity and what draws you to these kind of stories. Now, what came first, your interest as a trombonist or your interest in anthropology?
Well, I was a musician very early in life. I was a union member, 14, something like that. I played bass.
This was where?
Where? In South Jersey, outside Philadelphia.
Okay.
I played bass, a couple other instruments, and that seemed a reasonable thing to do for a long while, right into school.
Were you any good?
I was a union member. Does that count? I don't know.
Well, that just means you pay your dues.
Well, I got hired.
Okay, good.
And
professional.
I played, I played symphony gigs. I played R&B stuff, rock. I mean, whatever. And it was a way of living. It's a way of learning. I found it fascinating. I found, great people. It wasn't an easy life, and I sort of drifted into college and drifted into anthropology. Why I stuck with it was I had a teacher who was Austrian, and she spent a lot of time talking about the U.S. as if it were a foreign country, which it was for her. And every time she would do this, it would put me in a different place. I'd be looking at something or other and say, wow, it's not quite what I thought. And we were keeping scrapbooks of things that struck us that way. And I realized that there was a way that you could put yourself at a distance, still be a member of what you are, the society you're in, and still see it in a different way. And that really fascinated me. I thought, most people don't have any impulse to do that. I don't mean that you become a critic, you just step back and say, what's the scene about? What are these people doing? Why are they so enthusiastic about it? Why do they think it's so unique? Excuse me. that it's so special when so many other people do the same thing. And one of the things I remember being stunned by right in my first class was I forget the exact number, there are 36 or 7 kinds of kinship systems in the world. That's it. And they repeat, they occur in different places that are not connected, as if someone rolled dice and kept rolling them and coming up this way. Then I found that languages weren't infinitely possible. There were limitations all over the place. And I was fascinated with the idea that people who think they're the only ones who do something, or only ones who have something, there are so many other people who are doing the same thing, thinking the same way. And I thought, as I became a journalist later on, that there should be a thing in them, what they used to call a manual or a guide for the journalist, what not to do. You should never say, this is the only, that's the first, that's the last, or this is the death of. Something the Washington Post, I must say, is very easy at doing. They're always killing things. The death of the novel, the death of the film. I always quote Sun Ra, one of the people I wrote about, who said, music doesn't die. You can find music in any major city in the world, whether it's 18th century, Philippines, whatever. Some night of the week, they're going to be playing that stuff. No, musics don't die. They can't die. Musicians die. He said, they've been dying for the last 20 years. Then I was thinking, yeah, well, you know, it's true. It's the talk about it that dies. It's not the subject. It goes on. This is around the world, and what you asked the question, but I found that was, it wasn't so much a subject to make a living at it, but it was a way of living. And then, yeah, I guess you could say musicians have the same kind of position. They stare at audiences and wonder, you know, just what is this about exactly?
You alluded to something, this ability to have a critical detachment that enables you to observe.
Or suspension of criticism either.
Okay. So is that something you had to train yourself to do, or were you able to do this instinctively?
No, I wasn't, not at all. I mean, it was, having been born in the South in pre-civil rights days, and then brought to a northern, deeply, what do we say today, diverse community, that was a jolt.
But where in the South, by the way?
Yeah, it was in Black Belt, red clay country. It was Greene County, Alabama.
Okay.
But my first gigs were with all black bands, so I passed the first test, I guess. That was kind of a jolt. I think one thing was I took a linguistics course, and one of the first exercises was to try to figure out that why you shouldn't write, when you're writing phonetically, the word, I'm like trying to think, whale, W-H-A-L-E, and W-A-I-L has a slight difference in pronunciation, but you can't hear it. I mean, it's there if you stress things. A better example. If you, I forget the rule for this, but if you say spin, you hear a little sibilant that says spin, yes, right? If you say pin, you don't hear any. If you put a lit match in front of your face or a candle and say spin, the candle doesn't go out. You say pin, it goes out. There's a tiny gust of air that comes with it. You don't hear it, but it's there. So I was fascinated with the idea that there were things right in our language, right in our mouths, that we don't know what they are. And only a person who's standing way back from it and looks at it and says, yes, that's not the same, and W-H-A-L-E and W-A-I-L are not the same sounds, you just think they are.
I don't hear any real accent, but when you go back to Alabama, does it come back?
I don't go back to Alabama. It's, do you remember Dizzy Gillespie's line?
I'll never go back to Georgia.
Remember when he said he would repeat that in the Latin temple and then say, would you? Oh, I did go back for the Sun Ra thing, and it was better than I remembered. I went to a Lebanese restaurant where they were playing salsa, and I thought, you know, this has got to be better than I thought. And then I went to my hometown, which was really, I mean, it's nothing changed. It's Faulkner country. It's forest primeval. It's everything's just the same. And it turned out that two of the wildest musicians going are from that little town. It was LaDonna Smith and Davy
Williams.
Yeah, they're both in that little town.
Really?
And I said to them, so how'd you break loose from this town? I got moved by my parents. They said they went to Tuscaloosa once to a drugstore, and the drugstore was selling records. And these records are all black and white colored, and they look very strange. Their pictures were strange, and across the top it said, "You never heard such sounds in your life." I said, "Whoa, they were ESP records?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "We thought they were extrasensory perception, but it was really Esperanto."
Esperanto.
Yeah, so they had walked into the most avant of the music of the time from their little town, and went back saying, "We really haven't heard anything like this in our life."
Do you think people change with their environment? And I guess
in what sense?
The reason I asked, did it really change you? And if so, how, when you moved from Alabama to New Jersey?
Well, I mean, I think we first lived in a sort of flea bag hotel when I first moved, my family, and in one room for a long time. And my mother used to give me money to go across the street to the theater. There's a movie theater, and it wasn't segregated theater, but at least not formally, but on Tuesdays they had black films. So I was watching black films thinking they were Hollywood films, so I saw things like one that's actually getting some currency now, I've forgotten for what reason, called Sepia Cinderella, and another one called Two Gunslinger from Harlem. And I mean, I took this to be Hollywood. I thought this is what it was, but it was not something I'd seen in the South for sure, and they wouldn't even been showing those films, I don't think, at least certain neighborhoods. And they always had musical things that went with it, and I was really taken by the soundies, basically. They were the kind of things they played as video jukeboxes in those days. Most people didn't realize videos went back that far, but they did. And these musicians were pretty amazing. So I drifted somehow or other to seeing Lionel Hampton's band when I was still a kid on my own, and a huge theater. It must have been the, not the Earl, yeah, the Earl Theater in Philadelphia, all black audience. And I was blown away. It was a different performance aesthetic. It was, see if I could be more specific. Well, when soloists would walk to the microphone, they walked with a kind of confidence and assurance that I had never seen before with people of color. And I'd never seen it with white people. These were people who were completely at home with their idiom. This was their idiom. This is their thing. I was really affected by that. I found other people who had that same kind of reaction. They thought this was a different way of being. You didn't have to have a lot of money. You only had to have a skill, a high skill that nobody else shared with you. And I thought the humor of the crowd and so forth was quite different. I was thinking, I've been missing something. And then when I first played in African-American bands and for African-American audiences, I drifted into that. I was comfortable in it. It was, I was not surprised by it. It was a way of life that I could deal with. And again, it's coming in from the outside, coming in north from the south, coming in from white to black. I'm not making any claims on ever being black. I'm just making claims on appreciating things that I didn't know about before and coming to see that there were, within our civilization, whole varieties of being human that were very powerful. And there were kinds of engines of creativity, if you want. They were generating one thing after another. And as I got older and saw that this was the way show business works, that you kind of continually, show business and all the arts, I guess, the fashion, the rest of it, you have to continually reject what you had to introduce a new audience and sell it again. But in the process, it ends up recycling. So that when people my age would say to their grandchildren or something or other, well, I remember when that my day, it's true. Those shoes on those 40s actresses, whoa, the Jimmy Choos. You know, he's charging, what, I don't know, $1,000 a pair. Barbara Stanwyck was wearing them in 1942 in Double Indemnity. This is not a surprise, right?
Right, indeed.
And rap,
yes.
I'll say quickly, was introduced by Louis Armstrong, right? 1924 or 5, where he's talking rhythmically over a song.
At least on record.
And I must say, in a much hipper way, he's putting a 3-beat over 4 in his rap, and there's only a few rappers who can pull that off today.
Good point.
If I find rap is a little corny, it's because the rhythms are, shall we say, old.
As a musician, in your case, you had to assimilate an African-American aesthetic in order to be able to play with these bands.
Yeah, but radio was already a self-assimilator.
Okay.
I mean, the radio waves were filled with, when we moved to Birmingham, with, the thing I most remember is the gospel quartets had a distinctive style. When the soloists were going, there was a riff behind it that was often something like the words chankalanka, 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 and so on.
Sound like a Jubilee style?
Yeah, kind of thing. And it was they were riding on top of it, and I didn't at the time know that there were dance bands that did this, and R&B bands were going to do it, and that was a certain style. That was an audience style even. It was a way of supporting the thing. So I had heard that stuff, and it wasn't I think I heard it more than country music. I do faintly remember Hank Williams. But even Hank Williams was halfway there, right? He'd come up with a black guitar player, and he was always on the edge of the blues or something.
And listen to the way he phrases.
Yeah. And look, I mean, he was doing what mock Cajun accents, and he had the whole thing from teenage songs, car songs, really sad songs about death and dying, and lonely people. He covered the whole realm. I mean, country music has always had that reach, I guess. Well, it's the question of going white to black. This is fraught territory always. It's always, in the age you bring these topics up, they take a different angle. I mean, unless you're living in a dream world, you don't know that that certain performance patterns, speech styles, taste, sports gestures, etc., were shared widely. It shouldn't be a surprise to you when these things turn up crisscrossing. I know people talk about co-optation and stealing each other's culture, but we're in a culture which lives on co-optation. It lives on stealing other people's culture. I once gave a talk when I was pretty young. Someone said, "What's it like?" In the audience said, "What's it like to be living on somebody else's culture?" I said, "Is there anyone in the room here who's not living on somebody else's culture? Come on, I mean, that doesn't give you the license to well, I guess you don't need a license to copy people. That's done all the time, but
How about appropriation?
yeah, but there is I mean, that's the nature of art. I mean, art lives on that. I don't know that much about painting, but more I learn about it, the more I realize that one thing is spinning off another, and the painters are much closer to each other than I thought in their styles, and than let's say, than we're taught in classes. I always come back to that cliche. I think it's from Stravinsky, when he said something like, "Hack musicians, hack composers borrow, serious composers steal."
As an anthropologist, did you specialize in an area of the world?
Well, I thought I did. I was set to go to the Caribbean, and I couldn't find any way to pay for it, and getting kind of desperate, I saw an ad for Canadian government wanted people to do studies of agricultural regions in northeastern Canada. So I thought, well, plan B, that could be all right, I don't know. I think I'd read Henderson, The Rain King, where Henderson is an anthropologist, sort of, he's been to Africa, and he winds up in Newfoundland, or Labrador, I guess, and I thought, yeah, I could do that. So instead of the Caribbean, I was headed off for 27-foot snowdrifts and what have you. And so that's what I did for a while. And then I thought I deserved to go back to the Caribbean. I did some time in South Carolina, and then I went to Trinidad and Jamaica for a while and got into that. But I think overall, I wanted to do music, and it sounds like you should be able to do it because it's part of human life and whatever. But I ran into trouble everywhere I went. The first place I was at Temple University, where there were no courses on African-American anything, despite being in an African-American community in Philadelphia. So I thought I could give a course in African-American music and be the first. So I offered to do it for free, which is insane, not because I needed money, but because no one does anything free in universities. So I hear back from the dean of the School of Arts saying that I went around him to contact another dean, and that wasn't allowed, and the other dean said no, they weren't going to do that. Well, that was the beginning. Some years later, I was at Yale University, a much esteemed and celebrated place, and I thought, since I was writing a book on Miles Davis, I might offer a seminar on Miles Davis. So I said I would do that. It was rejected. Number one, because Yale doesn't normally do seminars on individual people, and number two, because Miles Davis hadn't accomplished enough. Well, I was thinking of responding in some vile, nasty way when a person who's in charge of such things in my department noted there were 37 such seminars going that semester, including on Gershwin and others, but there'd never been anyone doing an African American before. So when I pointed it out, I got apologized to, but nonetheless it was the same thing. Oh, I actually skipped a year. The first job I ever had was in Cincinnati, where they'd never had anything on African Americans. And I said I would offer some kind of course, and the chair of the department said, it's a non-subject, he said, and I read him to be saying on a non-people taught by a non-professor, I don't know. So it had three, by the way, the Miles Davis thing was in 2006, so it's not ancient history. But then I remember that one of the colleagues I had at Yale, still alive, was the first Jew hired at Penn State, so it's not, we're not talking ancient history here.
I want to ask you more about the Miles Davis and your other books, the Sun Ra, the Billie Holiday, the Alan Lomax. But you've used this term already for African American music. And I ask this question, it's a naive question, but I ask it anyway. I asked this of Ingrid Monson when she was here. What do you think is African about African American music?
You could have said, what's American about it?
We could do that next.
It's African. That's only partly glib. Well, there's several ways to think of it. You can think of it very musicologically and say, do we actually find swing rhythm in Africa? I think we do. I think it's, you could point to some places. They're not always where you would expect to find them, but they're nonetheless there. And when someone would say, well, so-and-so region doesn't sound anything like that. Well, it's true, Africa's a very complex place. So to put it that big in that big a category is a problem, but then we don't have any trouble saying European, and Europe's full of diversity from top to bottom, and from north to south. Europe, performance styles are radically different, and so I don't feel bad about that. Are we saying that there's something in African American music you're not going to find anywhere else? Yes. I'll start with the obvious one. I mean, I say this and I'm violating my own rules. You don't say anything is the first or the only, but you know, show me if I'm wrong. Simultaneous, improvised, collective music is not found anywhere else, at least not of my knowledge. That is, the musicians come in with only the smallest of, smallest framework to work with, maybe harmonic, maybe rhythmic, or whatever, and they proceed to collectively, with separate lines, without rehearsal, without planning, to make these lines weave together. And the wonderful part of it, at least in its earliest years, is they never clash. You can't find, let's say, an early New Orleans record where there is someone's musicians really playing wrong. So somehow they've got this all flowing. I think this is one huge, enormous kind of distinction. But there are others. The idea of multiple rhythms, putting rhythms on top of each other. Not that it doesn't happen in Europe, it just doesn't happen much. 3/4. Things that drummers in Europe didn't know how to do until very recently. And the amazing part was it took one drummer playing a drum set, an American invention, to do this. Now, in Africa, you had multiple drummers playing at once, but not the same drumming pattern. In America and England, you had them playing the same pattern. So you have this distinction. The remarkable thing is that one drummer could incorporate all the rhythms of 3 or 4 drummers in one set using feet and hands in 4 distinctive ways. And I remember saying something to a class once about that and saying in Africa, where you have these multiple drums, they often are, the rhythms are associated with certain deities. And they may be named even, and even baptized with names and rubbed with oils and so forth. And the student raised their hand and said, so if one drummer is playing all the drums, it's like polytheism, right? I said, if you will, why not? But I thought that the drum, if you look at a drum kit, even the modern one, the drums aren't all from the same place. The cymbals are still primarily a Turkish phenomena. You know, the zildjian is still the state of the art, stamped with oftentimes with Arabic letters. Is it? Tom-toms came in not from Native Americans, but from China, and the early drums looked like that. There used to be little bell-like things made of wood. Now you don't see them too often. The wood blocks were originally called temple blocks. They were coming in from Buddhists and other stuff. It's like you're seeing the collapse of empire in this set. You know, someone just said, "I want all that stuff," and bring it in. And then you watch very rapidly how it changes. The cymbals are, first of all, hanging, and the drummers only play on one thing at a time at first. And then they'll switch to the drums. And then somebody figures out a way that they can make the cymbals die faster, or bring it down into a reach, and then they put two together so they're clamped shut, and then they put a pedal on it, and then up to, I don't know, into the teens and 20s, drummers were still kicking the bass drum. They still call it a kick drum.
Oh, no pedal.
Yeah. And even when they put the pedal in, some drummers were still kicking it for effect, because it was a different kind of that plus, if I can get really weird here, the brushes. We're still talking these. No, the brushes are certainly not European. They look to me, well, I put it this way. The first brushes weren't brushes for brushing drums with. They were fly swatters. They're portable fly swatters. Now we're getting into African, what are those things called? You see them. Eddie Murphy used to use that, pretending to be an African and swirling this thing around. Fly swatter, you know, a different kind of fly swatter. Am I getting arcane enough with this?
Maybe.
It's also the way the instruments are played. And bending notes, I mean, I don't mean just blues influence, I mean making the instrument do what it's not supposed to do, which is now I know an avant-garde technique, but you will know this very well, but at the 1964 Carnegie Hall concert with Miles Davis, he plays My Funny Valentine, and he opens by fingering the horn correctly, but with no vibrato, there's no quiver to it, and rather awkwardly, da 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 da, da, da like an amateur, da 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 da. And to an audience that just paid big bucks to see this must be kind of strange to see a great trumpet player sounding like he didn't know how to play the trumpet. But then the next part is supposed to go up, the tune, da 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 da. He goes down, da da da. But he goes down so low that it sounds like his other instrument. Then he comes soaring back up, way over where the other part was, and then stops playing for about 1.5 bars. That'd be about 5 seconds. The feeling in an audience would be he's lost. He comes back in on a note played on the third valve, which can't be played on the third valve. That is, he's forcing it with his lip. He could have played it on the right valve, but instead he's playing on the wrong and is wavering. Now, that's a tour de force of saying, I'm not going to play like this instrument's meant to be played. And I'm going to have my audience hang on the idea, is this guy a complete fraud? Or is he losing it?
There are different kinds of virtuosity. It's not all about velocity.
Yes, and Miles Casey would say, sometimes you should play less. Well, you know this famous thing. Herbie Hancock said, when I asked Miles what I should be playing, well, how did he put it? I don't know what I'm supposed to play. He said, then don't play. And then at one point he said, Miles said, try sitting on your right hand. So he's left with nothing but the chords. And then Miles said, now sit on the other hand too.
Yeah.
So it becomes, and then of Count Basie used to say, it's not what he plays, it's what he doesn't play, which they also said of Paul McCartney playing bass, but, you know.
There's also a variation on play what you don't know.
Which is what Miles said to John McLaughlin, right?
Yeah.
He said, play the guitar like you'd never played it before.
So Miles has come up several times already in our conversation, and we were talking about him earlier. It's unavoidable. So you wrote a book about Miles, and you know, I mean, we all know, that jazz fans in particular hold very close to their mythologies. There's ideas that people have about these figures that they love, or the music that they love. How beholden are you to these myths? Are you seeking to unravel them, or what is your intent when you're trying to do research? How can you tell a story that hasn't been told 100 times already?
Well, the only books I ever wrote were on things that either I thought people would never write on them, and they were fascinating to me. That was the case with Sun Ra, or that the stories about them were so wrong, like Jelly Roll Morton, who was an intellectual. I mean, he was an extremely shrewd guy. Or Miles, in which I was very suspicious of the Miles stories. They were serving a certain, shall I say, male purpose in the 50s and 60s. They were similar to sports hero stories. I was very suspicious about that kind of thing because I was getting crosswinds from musicians that didn't sound the same. Yes, Miles could be at least annoying and often very nasty and cruel, but he was also an extraordinarily generous and thoughtful person, and I thought, this is something worth exploring to see how you pull all that together. I mean, I had already passed the point where I thought, that to be great, you don't have to be nice. Nice people, in fact, most great people aren't very nice because they're so committed to what they do, so one single purpose that they devote themselves to, and everything else falls apart around them. So I wasn't surprised by that, but what I was surprised by was how much he was thinking ahead of the other people and why he would do that and why he would be breaking the rules constantly. So this guy who has all the trappings of a super macho star, if you want, will nonetheless do things which no macho person would do, such as play Broadway show tunes in the 50s. Whoa, you know? The only two people who pulled that off were Chet Baker and he. And Chet Baker had a voice that sounded female, so he'd crossed a lot of borders. So I'm wondering, who else is going to play as a super cool tune, either Surrey with a Fringe on Top, really corny Oklahoma tune, even then, or maybe Bye Bye Blackbird, an ancient song, so what does he do with both of them? He plays them so slow they lose their original feel.
He strips away.
Yeah, and in Bye Bye Blackbird, he plays ba 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 and drops the blackbird. Ba 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 ba. Something a singer would never dare to do. So he's erasing. And then when you look at some of his early work, such as the arrangements that were used for his Birth of the Cool recordings, there is a kind of erasure going on there too. He'll take a tune that's based roughly around a George Shearing composition, a kind of quasi-bebop player, and he'll drop a lot of the harmonics of it, so there's empty spaces, and it's floating in between. I noticed that, and incidentally, I just remembered something on erasure, if I can remember the details of this. Rauschenberg, the painter, got the idea that it would be cool to erase a famous painter's painting and then put his name on it for erasing it. So he went to de Kooning and said, you can't erase a painting, so he settled on a drawing. Have you got a drawing I could erase and do it? And de Kooning said, this is stupid. He said, I know, he said, but I want to do it. So de Kooning goes to a lot of stuff, so he pulls out something and says, here, this is. So he takes it. By the way, he didn't completely erase it, or that would sort of spoil it. You can kind of see it. But it's mostly gone, and he wrote his name at the bottom. End of story. I mean, it's famous. Sold for a lot of money. Well, Elaine de Kooning, but de Kooning and Willem de Kooning and Elaine de Kooning, both writers, both painters, were big jazz people. And Elaine did a charcoal sketch of Ornette Coleman, which is quite good. I have a copy of it. And it's signed Elaine de Kooning. So I was at, you can see it on the web, by the way. I was at Ornette Coleman's birthday party, and he passed out copies of these no, it was a Christmas party, but Christmas presents. I look at it, and Elaine de Kooning's name has been erased, and his name is there. So I said, I thought this is by Elaine de Kooning. He said, yeah, but it's me, it's not her. So somehow, jazz history walked back into art history. Erasure.
So with Miles, are there any, I mean, you immersed yourself in what is out there. You interviewed all the right people. Are there any unanswered questions in your mind about Miles?
Well, there's always something unanswered. I mean, I don't ever claim to know anyone that well. I'm not surprised by much that people do, unless it's completely outrageous. I mean, how do people hold values that seem contradictory? How do they operate in that? How do they move between different behavior levels? How can they be at different levels of society and do that, and still maintain some kind of integrity? The kind of thing that most of us find hard to do, I think. It's people who are as comfortable with the maintenance people as they are with the CEO are rare, unless they're, I suppose, what's the word I want for that? A certain kind of character who, the kind of person who says, your mother just died, let's go on a vacation. Or, for jazz context, when the great Latin drummer, whose name is slipping away from me, with Dizzy Gillespie.
John Oposo.
John Oposo, when he was shot to death in a Harlem bar, it was said that someone walked into Birdland and yelled out, John Oposo's been killed. And somebody at the bar said, never mind that, how was his last set? Well, it's probably untrue, but the spirit of it.
It's a good story, apocryphal or not.
But it gets something else. And maybe that's the way we should operate. How was our last set? Yeah.
What did you think of Miles's autobiography? First of all, do you think it captured his voice?
Everyone said it did. To the degree that he talked too much, yes. He would have said a lot less. And no matter what it is, he would have said less. I can't get across how that works. Well, a small case that did happen. Someone who brought their young child up, 10-year-old kid, said, my son's only 10, but he plays trumpet, he loves your music, and so on. And the kid said, I really love your music. Miles says, you're only 10 years old, what do you know? That's a cruel thing to say, but it's true.
Speaking of true, I know that the tapes of the interviews that form that autobiography are at Schomburg, and you have read the transcripts of those tapes. How accurate is what is in the autobiography as opposed to what is in the transcripts?
Well, to answer that, I have to say that when you move from interview to anything else, other than quoting one-liners, you have to create a narrative. You have to create something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in this case, it's a life story, and you have natural beginning, middles, and ends, and you have to make those things work. And the same thing is true whether you had an interview or letters or whatever, overheard conversations. You're still going to have to make them fit those things. To that degree, no biography is ever accurate. It's always going to create a flow chart or a timeline, which may be correct historically, but that's not the way it was lived and felt. If you're not very careful in most art, you begin to say how the person felt. And the kind of biography I really hate says, he must have felt, he probably thought, and most of them say this, and all you're hearing is some fool who's conjecturing to keep the story going. Well, we all do that when we try to tell a story to someone. You know, what happened yesterday? You tend to throw things in. I said this to him, and he was saying so and so. Well, that plus the fact that you look at an interview, and interviews don't flow that nicely, and they're not chronological usually. So a lot of juggling's got to go on, and then to keep the narrative going, you can't possibly use those quotes sequentially. And what I found was that this was where it was departing from its, you have a choice, either to leave it out or just make it scattered. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. They tried to keep a narrative going, this is Quincy Troop, and frequently this required leaving out things, and that's part of the game, I guess, and others was changing the details of it. And it's readable as a result. It got very good reviews. The book's still for sale, but mine's not. I mean, you know, whatever. And in fact, this is what really hurt. When I got reviewed in the New York Times, I got 2 bad reviews in 1 week. Nobody gets 2 reviews in 1 week to begin with, but that was really weird. My agent said, well, that means it's really important, right? I said, yeah, right. One rather famous person said, my book should be read by people who are really interested in Miles, and Miles's book is full of inaccuracies and made-up stories, but his is much more fun to read. Well, I grant that. That's why that was done. That's why but I'm not writing books for fun, I guess.
Why are you writing these books?
In that case, to correct what was written. And because I know every writer who'd written about him cut out the parts of his music they didn't like. And I thought that was unconscionable. That's like saying of a business person, they were dealing in gold and then they were dealing in something else, and you decide, I don't like the gold part, I'll leave that out. It sounded dumb, I don't want to, it creates a character that's totally different than the other one, or a person who beat up his partner. I mean, leave it out and you've got another story and another person.
Can you give some examples of things that are commonly left out of these biographies? Not just of the Miles, but let's say the Billie Holiday.
I think the first thing that's left out, I'd love to be able to do that I can't do, is to talk about just how boring life can be. Even when you're wealthy and you're a star and so forth, there's a lot of boredom. I mean, I sensed a little of this at a low level as a traveling musician, and I mean, just think, let's leave aside music for a second. What if you're really a star, a super figure, and you've just appeared at Kennedy Center, you've had people leaping to their feet, and so on, and you go back to the hotel? That's a big jump. What do you watch CNN or something?
Do your laundry in the sink?
Yeah, well, one way you handle it is make your life into a kind of, I don't think a lot of people handle it, frankly. I think it causes them a lot of grief. But one is try to believe your own propaganda. Believe the audience and say, I'm always that. I'm always on. And I think musicians have a different take on this, I think, particularly those who aren't singers, because they're like abstract painters. They're not saying this is reality. They're saying this is in my head, it's a feeling. So they don't have to live with that feeling, although some do. Miles and Chet Baker were cool characters in the time. They walked, talked, they had minimal speech, they stared at people. I mean, that's why they're so quotable, because they said so little. You know this. In fact, I compared the two of the way they move. They're similar players and so on. Miles's stories about Miles always ended with some very funny but rude or violent comment. Every story about Chet Baker ended sadly. There was nothing funny about it. I mean, the funniest one I know is when he met Benito Mussolini's son, who was a jazz pianist. You know the one, right? He says, if I got it right, it was the drag what happened to your dad. I mean, that wasn't meant to be funny, but...
But this is what gets quoted over and over again. Yeah. And this is what I mean about...
Bob Dylan is experiencing this, by the way.
Yeah.
You know. Mm-hmm.
It's, there's this process of sort of, I don't know if it's romanticizing suffering or tragically misunderstood, or what we think artists are supposed to represent for us. But I sense that for the readers of these biographies, and I'm assuming, I mean, maybe I should ask you straight up, who are you writing for? Are you writing for the knowledgeable? Are you writing for the general audience? I mean, nobody gets rich writing jazz biographies, so why are you doing it?
I actually never thought of it, which is a flaw. You know, you should always create your audience, not assume it, and hope somebody's there to read it. I mean, from the very first words, you start shaping an audience, and somebody goes, that's it, you know, I'm not going to read anymore.
Is that how you approach this?
I just started writing it. It was not automatic writing, but I had no idea of an audience. And I was just thinking about Johnny Lydon has produced several, Johnny Rotten, as he's known, Sex Pistols and PIL and so on. He's written two autobiographies, both of them interesting. In the most recent one, he said, you know, being Johnny Rotten 24 hours a day was a tough job. I knew exactly what he meant, right? He was trying to hold that character in place. You can't do it. Actors can't hold their roles very well. I mean, they can try to fake their way through, but they don't go through life like that.
Besides, it's a contrivance to do that, whereas we always celebrate people being who they are.
That's why people who don't say much have a better chance of pulling it off. It becomes like, I think I said somewhere, it's like Daisy in The Great Gatsby. She spoke so softly and so little, you know, you were taken back. Well, I finally read the first version of Gatsby, and she talks a lot more and is much rougher on her husband, but it blows the book. I mean, it's somewhere, it's where the rich Anglo millionaire is talking about the lower races in the United States. This is the 20s, right? He said they're going to take over the world, and they're not like we're the creators of the world, they're taking over. And suddenly Daisy wakes up and says, kill them all, kill them all. And he says, all right, don't start with me. And then later in the same exchange, she says, we're all white people here, you know. But that's not a book that would have sold. He took that stuff out.
As a writer, biographer, as a scholar, I'm wondering how you assess research value. And by that,
research value?
Research value. And by that I mean, when you're going through papers, let's say, what are the kinds of things that make your eyes light up? Where's the gold in that stuff?
Well, I think most of the time, unless you're going to repeat things that are well known, you have to hope that something is that you haven't seen or heard. And the problem there becomes the way I opened my Miles book I was down in Soho at a bar in New York, and I was talking about this at the bar, and someone overheard it and said, Miles, and he gives me a story about Miles, and it was outrageous, both its content, but also it was impossible given the circumstances. So I knew it was made up. So I said, where'd you hear that story? And he goes, whoa. You want provenience? I mean, he said, we're talking about Miles here. Miles belongs to everybody. And I said, whoa. Now, this is interesting. If I'm going to write down everything that people tell me he did, I can have a fat book of a lot of stories, but if everyone thinks this character is theirs, they're going to be clashing. They're going to, stories won't work, and it was bad enough as what it was. So I was on guard about this, and I found this about sexuality, that people will give you these stories that on a given person, everyone I've ever written about, that seem to be impossibly sustainable. They can't have that much, I don't want to say versatility, it's not about that. Their range of sexuality is impossible or almost impossible to maintain. It would be a full-time job to do it. And you'd have to work at it, which is not exactly what we think these things should be about. And slowly you begin to find out that none of it's quite right, that they've taken something and pushed it further. And every now and then I'd be brought up short by somebody. So I get a call once when I was working on the Sun Ra book from Out magazine. I don't know whether they still exist or not. They said, we're interested in doing a piece on Sun Ra. So they started asking some questions, and they said, oops, not out enough for us. That was the end of that, right? So they were pulling him out of the gay realm for me, editing him out in that way. Miles, people kept trying to push him back and forth in these categories. I mean, so-and-so was there. It was always third or fourth stories. And what are they trying to say? That the other one is the fake and this is the real? I'm not saying that both are real, for sure. Maybe it's the period we're in where people want to see these kind of, it's like debunking the character sexually. You know, the macho guy is really the opposite, or you know, the wimpy guy is really macho. I don't know how that works, but it's boring to hear, and the stories aren't very interesting. I mean, look, most of life is tedious. Most of the dialogue is boring.
But nobody wants to read boring or tedious, much less buy it.
I know.
So what they want is the stuff of heroes.
Well, I mean, I thought that a black kid whose father was an orthodontist who raised prize-winning horses and bought prize-winning swine from Winston Churchill, who studied at Juilliard and studied with the first trumpet player with St. Louis Symphony, who was also a kind of proto-beatnik, a junkie, street person, who had made films, who had gotten the highest awards, who set fashions and so on. I thought that was story enough. And I had to get to people like his tailor. But the problem was he kept shifting styles. So I went to the Audubon Men's Shop in Cambridge, which is the arch preppy shop, still is, of all time. You walk in that shop and it's like walking into a certain zone of history. Now, fortunately for me, the owner was a Miles freak. And he saw the humor of all this. He saw the humor of Miles coming in with certain fabrics and saying, I want a suit made like this, and they were, you know, Baswegians and I don't know, whatever, you know, certain kinds of tweed. And the next time he sees him, he's getting Italian suits, and they're coming from somewhere else. And then he's getting Japanese clothes that are draping around him. Then he's got, I don't know, whatever. So he saw the humor of this, of changing your life to fit your fashions. And when I went to people like that to see how they would take that, what would your tailor say about you? Or I went to his dentist. That was interesting. His dentist, nice man, retired, kept changing the subject. He'd say, do you know Mercer Ellington? I'd say, no, I know who you mean. He said, very sweet man. He's been my patient for years. And I said, well, can we get back to Miles? And he'd say, by the way, do you know, I don't know, you know, some singer? I'd say, no, but, you know, it's a sweet lady and wonderful teeth. I'd say, doctor, can we talk about Miles? He wasn't very nice. I worked on a molar, yeah. So it's that kind of thing, right? No story there, just, you know, I worked on this molar and he wasn't very nice.
How did you approach the Billie Holiday story? I mean, this is also something that the narrative's been picked over often enough. How were you able to find something new?
Well, I was bothered by the fact that the story of her life had overwhelmed her music, and that the very best in his music was not being paid attention to, even though it was out there. It's still out there somewhere. And I wanted to make a case for her being a really important 20th century singer that set patterns that you don't maybe recognize. It's Frank Sinatra and Amy Winehouse, all kinds of people. You know. That was actually a very easy thing to do, and I was thinking not that interesting. But as I got into it, I found these other materials. I found stuff from her co-writer of her autobiography. I found the first draft of her autobiography, which had a lot missing when it went into print. I found some people who that she had had affairs with that were quite famous and were missing from these texts for fear of lawsuits and other things. So the person herself was changing right in front of me. Here's a woman who we knew about an abusive husband and about gangster boyfriends and drug dealers and times in jail, but we didn't know that she had had a long-running affair with an extremely rich woman whose mother was a founder of the Museum of Modern Art. that she'd had an affair with one of America's leading women poets. She had an affair with Orson Welles, with Tallulah Bankhead, great actress. So I really got interested in the fact that she was moving in a much different level of society than anything else had ever told us. Now, one reviewer said I was dropping names. Yes, I was dropping names, but I was trying to rebalance the names that were already there. You know, narcs and drug agents of various sorts. But now I had 2 books going at once. So I decided, well, I'll do them both at once and see how it goes. I had to cut back part of it. I think I got across what I wanted to, which was that it's a bad mistake to view a singer through their songs and try to read their life, to read their discography as their biography, for example. That there's an acting phenomena going on here. You're acting these parts. You're playing a part. And to think that the singer is always sad or always happy or whatever, usually they're sad, is a bad mistake. And I realized that that's why reviews of things are constantly quoting lyrics as if they were the person. Is she talking about that? I mean, is that, you know, that's pretty shabby work, I think. And I wanted to show that her life was more interesting than it appeared, and that she was much smarter than she appeared, because she'd been treated as if she were kind of dopey and drifting through life. And that, and I can curse myself, I didn't say this clearly, but I wanted to say that her autobiography is an indictment of virtually every American institution, from childhood and school right through to death, because each one of these things fails her. I should have said that more strongly, and I just slipped, lack of courage or whatever, I didn't say it. By and large, I think I pulled it off. The Washington Post reviewer thought it was terrible, which is to say I didn't represent the Billie Holiday.
That's what I mean about people clinging to their myths.
But I mean, even at her worst, are we talking now physical worst, mental worst, what she was doing things that, granted, with a voice that most people don't find great. She was doing things that great singers wouldn't dare to do. I'll just mention a couple. What singer do you know would take a song like Back in Your Own Backyard? I think that's it. It's a 1920s Al Jolson, you know, Dead song. She sings the song with the same, on the same A, I think it's A, same note 27 times. Blah, 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 you know, rhythmically. But, and even Gunther Schuller, great musicologist, said she pushed too hard on this. You know, well, what did she do next? The next note, at the point where she was in the song, is the highest note of the song. She sang it as the lowest note. And then when she reaches the point where the lowest note should be, she sang the highest note. So those 27 repeated notes put you in tension, like, what? And then suddenly it's going all over the place. And they're exercises in vocal artistry, always rhythmic and so on. Or,
by the way, do you think that's something, those choices she made, were those in the moment? Or is
oh, absolutely. Her stuff is different.
An alternate take would show a very different...
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing to talk about with her is she does something that nobody else has ever done, and I don't even know how you'd learn to do it. She never sings on the beat. Now, most people hear it as off the beat, and you'll find right now, Terry Teachout wrote the other day, she always was behind the beat. Well, if you're always behind the beat, when the band ends, you'd still be singing, so that can't be right. She's going behind the beat, then in front of the beat, and bouncing back and forth, and that was the trick. And I had some students who charted out both how her voice worked in terms of the band and their beat and the beat of the music, and she's never on either one of them. Now, here's a singer who was not taught to do this. I don't know how you teach it, but naturally had a feel for rhythm which said, don't do that. And if you were to take a young singer now and say, here's how you can be a success, don't ever sing on the beat. And then, by the way, throw in, and by the way, pick as your favorite songs, one about lynching, one about being a poor child, and the other about being, it's the third one, I can't remember. These are all bad career choices. She should have been terrible. She should have been awful.
But nobody follows. I mean, the point is she didn't have those rules. She was constantly breaking rules in creative ways. And this, I think, is what has always bothered me about the myth, is that it takes you away from the brilliance of what she did and instead dwells on her suffering.
I was pleased that I dared to say that some of her technique is Bob Dylan uses. And I'll stick with that. Bob Dylan noticed it.
You mean on the most recent recording you made? Of
No,
standards?
always.
Oh, really?
And damned if he hasn't said as much. He said, Billie Holiday and I had the same kind of problems, people liking we had bad voices, and he said we were behind the beat and so forth. So he knew it. I had a couple of things down, rather famous ones. I hesitate to mention it now if I get it wrong, but it was one of the early rock things. He's back and forth on the beat. I had always noticed that, and I don't think he's doing it on the new things. Maybe out of a kind of discretion about it. He's at a funny place on that stuff. But Dylan is very conscious of where he sat, and then he said, "Don't forget that John Hammond signed me, and so did she. Signed her." And then I looked to Hammond, and Hammond said, "You think I took a lot of grief for signing Dylan? Nothing to what I got when I signed Billie Holiday." They said, "This is not a singer." And that's what they said about Dylan. So I thought I was in safe ground there.
When you found, first of all, how did you find the draft of her autobiography? Was it at the publisher?
No, it was in the archive of Robert O'Mealy, a professor of English at Columbia. And,
in his personal collection?
Yeah,
Huh?
and it was on onion skin, the way they used to keep them.
How did he find it? Do you know?
I've learned not to ask those questions.
Oh, okay.
I
But
don't
you know me,
want to
have
make
to
this sound strange. It's just, do I need to know that?
I'm curious about provenance.
Well,
But anyway, if you'd rather
it wasn't criminal, I'm sure.
No.
Well, it's like finding the first attempt at a Billie Holiday biography by a woman who killed herself here in D.C. at a prominent hotel. No one had bothered to take it out of the library. It was just sitting there. No one would take it out. They didn't look at it. And I looked at it and said, "No, you know, 800 pages here."
So the changes between the draft and what finally gets published, how much of that is a professional editor who's striking things out, and how much of it was Billie saying, "No, I don't want to tell these stories"?
First of all, she had as a co-author who was himself a prize-winning journalist who had done, and none of the reviewers then, when it came out in '56, or now, bothered to look him up to find out that he had written the first long series of articles, well, the first series, but long series too, of drug addiction in New York in the early '50s. He wrote a prize-winning piece on Puerto Ricans in New York and their problems with housing and jobs and so forth, back when they were more of a new phenomenon.
This is William Duffy?
Yeah, and he'd also been a political speechwriter for, I forgot who it is now. He'd been a writer for labor magazines, for union magazines. So he had this big career, and he was the top writer of the New York Post at the time. They treat him as a hack, and they always say he was a hack tabloid writer. Well, I mean, tabloid is the shape of a newspaper. That's a cheap thing to say. This guy had good credentials. He knew the music. He played piano, and he'd done some gigging and stuff. And then I found his letters through a partner of his, and I found that he had taken on her critics, at least, if not written about them publicly, in a rather severe and interesting way. For example, when Strange Fruit appeared, and this was seen to be a song about lynching, that set off all kinds of bells. So, Southerners didn't want to hear the song, and people were objecting to it. And people were saying that the FBI contacted her and wanted to know if the Communist Party had urged her to write the song. It turns out it was written by a member of the Communist Party. That they hadn't looked that up yet, I guess.
Abe Mirapol.
Yeah, who adopted the
Allen.
Rosenberg children after the parents were killed.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But the FBI hadn't looked that up yet, so they were they were coming from the wrong end. So I'm trying to think who he wrote this letter to. This is her co-writer. He said, the FBI and critics have said that this poor, ignorant black girl, barefooted in their mind, isn't able to think for herself. In fact, several writers said that she didn't know anything about lynching when it was a common phenomenon at the time. Everyone knew about it. And said she wanted to treat her as this ignorant, illiterate person, when in fact she knew every word of that personally. She knew the consequences of it and so on. Said she could have easily have sung faux spirituals like Marian Anderson, in Washington, in a famous incident on the Oval, was it, or somewhere, and passed herself off as a good Christian girl who was, knew her place, and said she wouldn't touch songs, fake singing like that. Everything she sang was from personal feelings. I'm slaughtering the emotion which she brought to this, but he was pointing out this huge, almost conspiracy between journalists and institutions of justice to present, to nullify the song, to treat it as not an important document. And a song about lynching as a pop song, whoa, then or now, is stunning. And to perform it in nightclubs with people with drinks in their hand and good food was not only outrageous, but it required a whole staging, which meant the lights had to go out. You had to shift the whole atmosphere, or the whole place would be in chaos, right?
A little pin spotlight on her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hated the idea that she was just called a jazz singer, because the early jazz people didn't call her a jazz singer. So now she's being called it when jazz is not in its heyday. When it was in its heyday, she wasn't a jazz singer.
So there was a response to the book at the time, whether it was from her peers or whether it was from the general public. And then it's maybe 2 generations later that people experience it again with the film that was made starring Diana Ross based on the book. Do you have any thoughts about that film?
Well, I mean, she was a good singer. I mean, it was as good as singing as she did, but it wasn't Billie Holiday singing. But beyond that, and this is something that Diana Ross herself questioned, that the biography was being scuttled here entirely to create a new figure. And Barry, what's his name? Gordy, yeah, said his famous remark was, white people change the biographies all the time in the movies, why can't we? Well, it's hard to argue with that because it's what does happen. They turned it into a 50s melodrama with a housewife becoming crazy. It opens with her in a straitjacket, screaming on the floor. Billie Holiday didn't scream. She's never in a mental hospital. I mean, come on. But then they introduced this sympathetic male character who's more like her father than her lover, who's going to make things right. I found it disgusting. But, hey, it won some prizes. It did well. I mean, I said the same thing about Jelly's Last Jam, which I thought was an atrocity. It won 6 Tonys, using swing arrangements instead of, and not his tunes, because he had trouble with Lomax, the author of the book they were using. So I had trouble with all those films that attempt to do the history of black music as if it were done yesterday.
Well, they're not documentary films, these feature films. Do you think there are any really well done feature films about this music?
That's a tough one.
I mean, did you like Round Midnight? Young Man with a Horn?
I like things about it. I didn't think it was because of that. I mean, I thought Young Man with the Horns, a nice picture of New York at that time, and some other things, some daring writing. And I thought, what was your other example, Around Midnight?
Yeah.
I thought it had some nice stuff in it. I thought some of the music was ill-chosen. I thought the acting was brilliant. When I found out that Dexter Gordon had been rewriting his part every day, and I talked to the director about it at length. He said he'd come in and say, I can't say this. And so I was really impressed with that, but I found the film a downer in the wrong sense of the word. Has there ever been a good one? I'm about to say no, but holding on. There's a funny way in which the Chet Baker story, which nobody's seen, I guess.
Oh, the recent film?
Yeah,
Yeah,
a funny way in which I found it interesting. In spite of all its flaws, I think because it was so understated and on the edge of boring that they really had his character. Whereas the Miles film was going over the top to turn it into a buddy film, action film
Car
kind of,
chases, yeah.
in which Miles's character gets lost entirely. So to that degree, the one film is much better made, the other film is cheaply made by necessity, but stayed closer to the character. Not that it was great. Let's see, there must be something here. Well, what's that film with Louis Armstrong playing
A Man Called Adam?
Yes.
Yeah, with Sammy Davis Jr. And Frank Sinatra Jr.
Too Late Blues, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Cassavetes, yeah. But nobody sees those films.
Yeah, well, they're worth seeking out. I mean, it's like the music. You have to know what to look for or to listen for, and the people who are truly interested will seek them out.
There were also those TV films like Johnny Staccato, nobody knows it.
Yeah.
Or
That's another Cassavetes, isn't it? Isn't he the star?
yes,
of it? Yeah.
which was Second City used to mercilessly parody. This is a kind of small jazz bar from the neighborhood, and a private detective comes in and sits in with the band. They had good musicians, if you recall, really serious musicians playing. He'd sit in a piano, and a crime would occur, and he'd go solve it. In Second City, which I guess it was turned into Saturday Night Live later, they have him saying, well, I got to finish the set before I go outside. So people are getting their throat cut or beaten up, and he'd go out. It's always too late. But there was also another, Peter Gunn. Peter Gunn at his best had a kind of laconic, whatever kind of quality to it. When people are being beaten up, the music is going on. Yeah, well, finish the drink. And
Pretty good music in that. Henry Mancini.
it was, who was the director? A big-time director later. But they had the idea that something could
Like
happen.
Edwards? No? I maybe think
It was, they thought you could make a bar a world, what happens in a bar. And the first time I had ever been in a bar, I think I was 15, in a place called Billy Kretschmer's, I had that feeling. It was a little place that had been a prohibition place in Philadelphia on a back alley, dead-end street. It was perfect. It was film noir at its best. And Billy Kretschmer was a clarinet player, and between sets, would tell you about Al Capone or whatever, and how Al Capone stiffed him. And the musicians are crowded in a corner. And as young as I was, I could live in there. In fact, I remember very clearly first, I was walked in the door and I saw something so impressive, I've never forgotten it. The bartender, who I thought was old, but he probably was 40, saw two men about to hit each other. They were shoving. He leaped over the bar, just sprung over, which is an act of real strength anyway, landed right beside them, put his arms around them, and said, gentlemen, surely we can solve this in civilized ways. We're all gentlemen here. I'll buy a drink for both of you. Please, sit, not next to each other, but please sit down and so on. He sits down, and as he walked away, I saw he had a sawed-off pool cue stuck in the back of his pants. And I thought, this is, I could stay in this bar. And then I heard Lush Life by, a song is as sad as it comes, about what it's like in those bars, what your life is like. By the way, did you see how Lady Gaga sang that at the couple?
No, the Billy Strayhorn song.
Yeah, I don't know if people know this, but it's sung about failed love, alcoholism, drinking your life away, living with people who are drunks, sad.
There's also a film. Do you know this film, Lush
No.
Life? Yeah, it's Forrest Whitaker and Jeff Goldblum, about two jazz musicians
Really?
in New York. Talk about obscure films, feature films. But
Girls who had all distingué faces, distingué traces, I said.
Yeah.
Sad and distingué traces.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what was I thinking of with that? When it was sung by Lady Gaga at the Academy Awards, the ending goes down to scale, and there I'll live
While I rot with the
while I
rest.
rot with those whose lives are lonely too. She takes it up as triumphant. And I thought, how can you see this as a triumph? Perverse.
Yeah. We've been talking about a lot of your past glories. I want you to catch us up, and let's talk about what you're doing now. What's this book you're working on? And why don't you talk a little bit about what you'll be researching while you're here at the library this week?
Maybe I can make the same answer into one, maybe not. Well, I'm doing a book on Harry Smith, and my experience has been when I say that, the two responses, one is Harry who, and those who know him say, this is a mistake, don't do it. And that was generally the publisher's view. The cool people would say, oh, I know this book. They take it to their seniors who'd say, no, this is not a book. So, Harry Smith is known for producing a very influential 6 LP set back in '52 that changed the nature of folk music in America ever since. And Dylan recorded, I think, 14 or 15 of the songs from that album. They were songs that had been around, had actually been recorded 20, 25 years before, but somehow seemed like they were from Mars. They were so different. Sound was different, the quality of voices. And it sort of gave license to a new kind of singer, Dylan, for example. He didn't have to sing like other people in that way. So he's known for that and the daring of doing this, even though it wasn't an original thing in itself. Lomax had done it before him. But before that, he'd been an experimental filmmaker in Southern California and made a number of animated films which were famous for either being hand-painted, which is nightmarish, where you have to repeat the same frame and try to get it close enough to the previous frames. And then he put interesting scores to it, like Thelonious Monk or Dizzy Gillespie or Zulu dancers or something or other. Or he used cutouts from odd sources, Muscle magazines, Negro Achievement. I don't know. He would create these strange conglomerations of fantasied animated figures. And it moved him, and he also did paintings of records, that is recordings and songs, where he tried to get a visual representation of the sound, not the words of it. He at 15 had national acclaim as a student of Northwest Coast Native Americans and had already done archaeology and gotten things in museums. He had salvaged some totem poles from wreckage. He had recorded songs and tales. He was writing, I'm talking 15 years old here, he was writing grammars and making word lists of several different Native American groups and so on. He was invited to be part of and may have been inducted into secret societies when white adults couldn't go in. That would be enough right there, but in 1951, he attracted the attention of Hilda Ribe, who was the basic founder of the Guggenheim Museum. It was then called the Museum of Non-Objective Art. So he came to New York on an early Guggenheim grant. But Harry was also a junkie and was living without any means at all. He had lived part of the time over a black bar in Fillmore. It was an all-black neighborhood then, and he survived getting free meals for painting murals and the like. And he came to New York, he said, to meet Duchamp and Monk. And I'm still trying to figure out how those two things work out. And then he moved down the East Village. And off and on, for the rest of his life, he lived with no income at all. The money would come into his hands, apparently never more than, say, $6,000 to $10,000 a year. But it was always spent on some project or other. And he was sick or drunk or out of it for much of his life. And what's interesting to me is that he drew around him this enormous crowd of people. Let's see if I can rattle some off. He was once back for one of his films, which was an animated version of Wizard of Oz. He was backed by Elizabeth Taylor and the heirs of Avon Products, the heir of AMP, Huntington Hartford. What was he the heir of? I don't know. Big money people. Allen Ginsberg underwrote him for a while, had him living there. The co-inventor of the helicopter, Arthur M. Young, financed him for a while. Tennessee Williams always spoke well of him. Arthur C. Clarke asked him to advise him on 2001, lived in the Chelsea, free. It goes on and on. But the problem here is there's no coherent life there. There's a puzzle. That's why I did it, frankly. I thought this is unwritable. I thought, can I do this? I mean, no one's going to do it. Can you make something out of this? He wound up, let's see, he went out to Naropa Institute. He lived in a little shack on campus where he would give these lectures high on various drugs. By the way, this guy was so serious about drugs and art that he would list in the notes for his films what drugs he was on and what point in the film he was using them, so he could weigh them against him. So he would go to classes talking about American Indian stuff, and he'd be very high, and cutting in and out of the lecture, he'd switch to, none of you have ever read Alice Longworth Roosevelt's books, right? You should have, you know. You don't really know what was happening there. So the challenge I thought was, first of all, his books are all in a warehouse over in Red Hook in New York, because Getty, who has all of his artworks, didn't want them, and they would fill a New York apartment floor to ceiling. So I said, I'll read these books. So it's now come clear to me I'm not going to be able to read those books, but he did. He spent all his money reading this stuff. And
Did he make any notes in the books?
Yeah, but they're usually notes to connect things, like song types, you know. And, I mean, he was into folk song. He collected. At one point, he was seriously trying to get every known version of Shine in the Titanic, either the song or the folktale, or Barbary Allen, the old Appalachian type thing. So really different kind of material. One is a comic piece about the guy who doesn't die in the Titanic because he jumps overboard, no one believes him, it's sinking. And the other one about a woman who rejects her man and becomes the coldest known figure, and he hates her and so forth. So he was trying to do that kind of stuff, and he was collecting peyote materials, both eating them and studying them. He managed to get samples of every Seminole woman's dressmaker, of which there were 20-some. These patchwork dresses, very elaborate. Smithsonian's got them. In fact, Smithsonian has films of this stuff. And his stuff is in the Louvre, the Smithsonian. Not here, though, right? No, I doubt.
We have yet to look. So you say that this is a book that might well be unwritable. So how do you write a book that's unwritable?
I don't know. I mean,
you're still in the research phase, or?
Well, I better get out of it fast, because the Whitney's going to do a big thing on him in 2019. And if I don't have it done by then, it'll become a period piece. I don't know. There is a model, but I couldn't follow it. The guy, an English guy, who found a bum, who he befriended, and he offered to write the bum's life story, which he did. And then he would give the chapters to the guy, and the guy said, this is boring and dull and depressing. No one wants to know about my life. And he was going to give the guy the money from the book, and now he's depressed too. So the guy said, now, if you were writing the book backwards, where I turned out to be this nice middle-class kid with great prospects, it would make more sense. So as weird as this sounds, he wrote the book backwards, and it won him a huge cash prize, and it sold very well. His second book, he discovered that his landlord, who lived in the basement, was a world-famous mathematician who had made some bad mistake on one of his projects, lost his job at Cambridge University, and was living in the basement on rice and something else. It seemed to be half a lunatic. And he wrote a book about this guy's life, and it's filled with drawings of advanced mathematics and so forth. His third book, he found a huge pile of manuscript in a dumpster, And he thought at first it was by different people. It's 40,000 pages of handwritten stuff. It was one woman's diary. So he decided he would write a book on that diary and found out she was still alive. And off he goes. Now, these are really interesting books because they're critiques of biography. They tell you there's something wrong with biography, you know. And he incorporates their criticisms. So all three of these people said, this is crap. And when he would say, why is it crap? Then he'll incorporate well, I don't know, I don't think I can do that, but.
Something tells me you like a challenge.
Yeah, I guess.
To write the unwritable.
Is there anything unwritable?
I don't know.
Anything that's notable should be writable, right?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Look, Sun Ra was unwritable.
True. Well, I don't know.
But I'm very proud of that
He
book.
wrote
I'm
quite a
very
bit
proud of that
himself.
book because I followed the logic of what he was reading, and that took him back into Frankenstein. Who else read the books that Frankenstein's monster read?
Oh.
That became his reading list, right?
Really?
Yeah, and they were really important books, by the way.
Did Frankenstein's monster read Madame Blavatsky?
No, it was too soon.
Oh, okay.
But he read a more important book, Count Augustine Volney's The Ruins of Empire, which is like a sci-fi story of being taken to see the ruins of civilizations and so forth. So that was the first one, where Africa is the beginning of civilization, by the way. So I started reading these things and wondering, was this character crazy? Because he was talking about things that sounded insane. And then I began to find that they were written about, and these were, you know, for example, he was talking about at one point white people who passed themselves off as being Egyptians and turning Egypt into a European country rather than an African country, which is quite true. So I started reading that, and I found out that the English upper class at one point in the 19th century, there was a movement among them to declare themselves as the original Egyptians, and that to treat Egyptians as fakes or as, you know, savages of some sort. But before that had been a group who thought of themselves as the original Jews. Now, I found it really fascinating that upper-class people had moved from being the original Jews to being the original Egyptians, because in which case they would have had to, in a way, I guess they did drive their ancestors out of Egypt in the process. But I thought this was really strange. And they were called, it was called the Identity Movement. Does that ring any bells? It's turning up in the news right now. Breitbart has some identity articles. The Christian identity movement included, what's his name? Timothy McVeigh and the guy, Rudolph something, the guy at the Atlanta bomber. They were both Christian identity people. Well, these people are the heirs of that previous group who think they're the original something or other. So I'm pretty proud of this. I can just see Sun Ra's reading as he's reading what he's reading. He's saying, look at these crazy white people. They're turning themselves into Jews, Egyptians, and bombers.
It's clear that you know quite a bit about a lot of things, and that shows up in your writing. But let me ask this last question for now, and we'll take note of the fact that this is just the first part of our interview. You're going to be back in the fall for part 2 of your residency here. So let me end this part by asking, since you know quite a bit and you draw from a lot in your writing, in your books, are you able to just listen to music without context, just for the joy of it?
Yeah, always.
And give me some examples of what kind of music just brings you joy without any backstory.
Well, what context would there be for Sun Ra music? I mean...
Well, you know a lot about Sun Ra now.
Yeah,
you know how it all fits together.
I don't...
but okay, let's take Sun Ra.
It's an anti-style.
Okay, so what is it you like about Sun Ra?
Well, I mean, I like the fact that I was born in the same town as he was and was living there at the same time. And then found out I was living only a few blocks away from him many years later. And I thought, this is like, synchronicity at its best. And I can, I used to run into him in various places. And every time I did, there was something weirder coming out of it. I mean, imagine a guy getting out of a stretch limo wearing a gold lame robe and a kind of space hat, eating a hoagie. Or going to see him at Swarthmore College, a place that was really an out school where students really thought they were the avant something. And they freaked out when they saw this stuff. It was just too much for them. They ran out. But what happened there was they were selling records outside, and they were all blank with a name on them, but you couldn't tell what they were. And I said to the guy selling them, "What kind of music is this?" He said, "Well, this is outer space music, and this is cocktail music." I said, "All right, I'll take one of each." I go, "It's true. One was, tea for two, and so and so, and this was synthesizers going flying through the roof and what have you." I don't see a context for this except that it's the context of no context. It's I mean, I made a context in the book, but it's crazy. It leaps across Southern Baptist belief in this and that, Southern California athletic Christianity, space abduction myths. I just pulled out all the stops for it, but I never think of the music that way. I mean, let me see. Do I ever think of context? Country music, yeah, maybe, but not jazz. Look, to me, it's like abstract painting. If you can go look for something, you could say, "Oh, that's really a river," or "Isn't that, isn't there a person standing behind that?" Something, but that's not what it was intended to be, and it's supposed to be about. Well, if I understand abstract expressionism, it's supposed to be about feeling and improvisation. It's supposed to be free expression of feelings and emotions, maybe even spiritual and surrealistic in some ways. And so I hear the music that way too. It's operating at another level. I do understand why drugs work with music. I mean, I do understand, before it damages you, it does take you to some place that's like that.
I can say for myself, I love walking through an art gallery or museum, but there's nothing like walking through this museum with an artist who has a different way to see things that I might not notice.
That's true.
And this is why I love to sit down and talk to you about music, because you notice some things that I might not otherwise notice.
But not necessarily a context.
Well, okay.
Maybe fine-tuning or something?
Yeah, just as a
But here's what happens: you walk through a museum with the wrong person. Because with Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie,
yeah.
Well, we know something about this guy. They've recreated his studio from pictures, and there were piles of Boogie Woogie records. And he was playing them all the time. He was dancing while he was painting. And he intended this to look like those things sounded like, which is, colors moving in cross patterns and so forth. End of story. I mean, that's it. He wrote essays on this. He talked about the disappearance of perspective, flattening out. We're working on a simple plane. Color is now interacting with color. Volume is moving in different ways. It's all written out. So I go to the Museum of Modern Art to see the show. They've got the records piled up there. And who's the commentator but Wynton Marsalis? And Wynton Marsalis looks, this is over, through your earbuds, is looking at Broadway Boogie Woogie, and he says, "You see the black line around it, which is the frame?" He says, "That's the powerful force of Louis Armstrong's trumpet." Now, it turns out that Mondrian didn't give a damn about Louis Armstrong. But,
It's a nice story.
The thing is that Boogie Woogie is not in the canon. I mean, it's too close to rock and roll, right?
Yeah, a lot of nice stories. We're going to continue this next time, and I'll look forward to it. Thanks,
Thank you.
John.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.